Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's conference on a highly important issue of gender equality in Europe. I am welcoming you on behalf of the European Institute for Gender Equality and the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth under Germany's presidency of the EU Council and Germany's chair of the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers. My name is Astrid Frohloff. I'm a German TV moderator and journalist, and I have the pleasure to guide you through today's conference. And I'm also very glad that I have the pleasure to introduce to you the Federal Minister Franziska Giffey, who is joining us today. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to have you here today.
Thank you very much and greetings to all.
Yes. We will explore today what impact the COVID-19 pandemic has on gender inequality in the fields of labor market, unpaid care, and gender-based violence in Europe. And we want to discuss about what consequences this possibly might have on political actions. We will have 2 rounds of panel discussions, and you, dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, you are invited to join our discussion. We are glad if you put questions and use our Q&A tool. You find a button on the homepage, so questions are welcomed. Let's start right away with the first panel. We want to focus on the agenda of Germany's current presidency on the EU Council, as well as on the incoming Portuguese presidency. And I have the pleasure now to introduce to you the panelists of our first round. Besides Federal Minister Franziska Giffey, we are highly delighted to welcome Helena Dalli, EU Commissioner for Equality. She is in the EU responsible for fighting against discrimination and empowering equality and inclusion. Nice to have you with us, Mrs. Dalli. From Portugal, who is taking over the presidency on the EU Council in January from Germany, we are welcoming Rosa Monteiro, Secretary of State of Citizenship and Equality, who is an expert on gender equality and studies on women. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mrs. Mariana Vieira da Silva, who was supposed to join us today, actually is unfortunately not able to participate due to imperative political commitments. And last but not least, we are very glad to have Carlien Scheele with us, Director of the European Institute for Gender Equality, EIGE. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm looking forward to get your perspectives, but first of all, let's get some facts and figures. Here's a short film which is painting a picture of the current situation of women in the European Union.
Gender inequality in the labor market is still a reality.
Okay, jetzt brauchen wir das Einspiel etwas lauter.
Gender
Jetzt
gaps
verstehen wir es
remain
kaum.
in terms of pay, employment rates, and employment contracts. Care work is critical. Here, women workers make up more than half the total workforce, and they face tough working conditions. Gender equality in the EU faces another threat: violence against women, which includes physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. The COVID-19 pandemic has further worsened these problems. Domestic violence reports have increased in several countries, and many women find themselves facing a higher risk of infection because they are employed in the health and social sectors. However, some positive trends are on their way. In Germany, for example, families share domestic work more equally during the pandemic. How will the EU face these challenges?
Well, how will the EU face these challenges? This is exactly what we want to talk about now. And I would like to ask Mrs. Giffey. Well, these are concerning figures, of course. As Germany is currently holding the presidency of the Council of the EU and chairs since yesterday the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, what are your priorities for the 2 presidency, and how would you like to address this issue?
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have seen already in this film what are our priorities. It is obvious that we have to take care for gender equality in these both fields, the equality of payment between women and men, but also the fight against violence against women. And we want to reduce the gender pay gap, which is a European-wide issue, and we want to support the public infrastructure for care work to enhance the conditions, the working conditions, and improve the working conditions in the social professions. And we are really struggling to have a big European discussion and a European development concerning the equal share of unpaid work, which is still very not equal. And that's why we plan to do the council conclusions on the 3rd of December to really have a clear and common statement for the equality of payment between women and men. And we have a very important thing concerning the violence against women. We have a project which is concerned to this number. This is our help telephone, which is functioning in Germany, the 08116 016, which is a helpline, and we want to use our EU presidency to bring that all over Europe and to work together with all our partners in Europe so that this number is not only working in Germany but also working in all the European countries. And we have a strong support even from our Portuguese colleagues, and I'm very grateful for that. And we plan to bring that really into practice and into the operative mode.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to ask Helena Dalli. You are the Commissioner for Gender Equality. This year, the Commission presented its long-awaited Gender Equality Index, Gender Equality Strategy 2020 to 2025. What are currently the Commission's main objectives and initiatives concerning gender equality?
Thank you. Thank you for this question, and thank you for asking me to participate to this meeting. The gender equality strategy is a strong and future-oriented framework for a Europe where women and men, girls and boys in all their diversity are free, and where they have the opportunity to thrive and to lead. So gender equality is a fundamental value for the EU, and it is an obligation for us all. It is a human right and a necessity for building a resilient and a competitive Europe. So gender equality is being challenged on several fronts. A visible and organized movement opposing progress in women's rights and gender equality has upped its ante, I would say, in recent years in Europe and internationally. And we need to keep up the fight for gender equality, in particular when the COVID crisis has such a gendered dimension. So delivering on the gender equality strategy and the priorities of a union of equality is thus essential. And the strategy delivers on a number of crucial issues. Tackling the gender pay gap through pay transparency. Thus, the Commission will adopt binding pay transparency measures, increasing female representation in decision making. On this front, we call on the member states to adopt our proposal to improve gender balance on company boards, made already way back in 2012. It delivers also on combating gender-based violence and violence against women, a problem that, as you have already pointed out, the COVID-19 lockdowns have only intensified. Achieving better work-life balance for parents and carers by supporting the member states in their transposition of the 2019 Work-Life Balance Directive. So the implementation of the strategy will be based on the Commissioner's dual approach of targeted action combined with gender mainstreaming across policy areas. And to this end, the Commission has set up a task force for equality to ensure the implementation of equality mainstreaming, including gender equality. And in order to reach all women and girls with gender equality measures, intersectionality is an important horizontal consideration in the new strategy. So to deliver on the Union of Equality, we recently adopted a framework on Roma inclusion, the Anti-Racism Action Plan, and the LGBTIQ equality strategy. And next year, we will present the EU strategy for the rights of people with disabilities also.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Dalli. Let me pass over to Carlien Scheele. Mrs. Scheele, you are the director of EIGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality, the only full-fledged European body that is dealing with gender equality. How can EIGE help the EU and member states to achieve gender equality? Could you tell us a bit about your current researches and how it feeds into the European gender equality policy?
Yes, of course. Thank you. And again, good afternoon to all of you. What policymakers need to develop well-informed policies is information and data. And that's what we do. EIGE is the EU's knowledge center on gender equality. We get the data, information, and we also analyze it. And to give you a few examples of instruments we use, the first one I would like to mention is the Gender Equality Index. The index looks at 6 important domains in daily life of EU citizens, and we use the scores between 1 and 100. And 100 means full gender equality in a country or in the EU. We have recently released our 2020 Gender Equality Index, and there we saw that the overall score for the EU was 67.9 points out of 100. And we concluded that if we go along that pace, so to say, if we continue this way, it will take another 60 years to achieve gender equality in the European Union. And that's to say, if nothing happens, but we all know that, of course, we are now hit by the COVID-19 crisis. There's also other backlashes in the European Union, but so this means something. Another issue I would like to mention is the topic of gender-based violence that the Commissioner also mentioned as an important topic in the strategy of the EU. What EIGE does is helping member states to improve the quality of their data. It's still very difficult to give a reliable picture of this of gender-based violence, which means that what we do now, and the figures are already alarming, it's not the full picture that we should have. So that's how we support member states to improve the quality of their data. We're estimating the number of girls at risk of FGM, female genital mutilation. We are examining emerging data on cyber violence at the moment, and we will soon launch a handbook to prevent sexism in the workplace. So that's a few topics related to gender-based violence. I would also mention a third topic, which is gender mainstreaming. We have developed tools and instruments to help member states and also EU, the Commission, to mainstream gender in all portfolios, because it matters everywhere. So every portfolio has a very relevant gender dimension. And this year we released a gender budgeting toolkit to help ensure that women and men are able to benefit equally from the EU funds. I could go on for much longer, but let's not do that. But to sum up, so we assess, we collect, we assess, we analyze, and we also develop instruments to support member states and Commission to improve gender equality within their work. Thank you.
Thank you for the moment, Mrs. Scheele. I would like to pass over to Mrs. Monteiro. At the end of this year, Portugal, as I mentioned, will take over the EU Council presidency from Germany. How are you planning to follow up the efforts of Germany in the field of gender equality?
Thank you again, and good afternoon from a sunny Lisbon. Thank you for this invitation. First, I would highlight the trio declaration on gender equality. In fact, Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia have created great synergies as trio and like-minded partners. And this declaration calls for high standards for preventing and combating all forms of violence against women and girls in the EU under the Istanbul Convention. And Portugal strongly supports the mentioned already initiative of the German presidency for an Europe-wide phone number that redirects calls to national helplines. To follow up on this, the Portuguese presidency will host a high-level conference on the 10 years of the convention. This will be a unique opportunity to take stock of its implementation and reinforce also its standards. Also, the issue of the gender pay and care gaps that the current presidency is emphasizing is for us also fundamental, especially considering the pandemic situation. In this connection, the Portuguese presidency will focus on the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 on gender equality. And finally, the issue of gender balance in company boards. We strongly support the German presidency in its efforts and plan to build on their very important work also on this issue. But the bottom line is for us how we ensure a line of work that goes beyond presidencies and trios. We need to keep gender equality and violence against women high on our own agendas, especially at times of crisis such as the one we are living, when gender inequalities tend to increase and established women's rights are challenged. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Montero, for the moment. Let me talk to Mrs. Giffey again. We should talk about one issue which is really taking us busy currently, the pandemic. The pandemic began shortly before the German presidency on the EU Council started. What challenges does the pandemic bring with it for gender equality policymakers in Europe and for your work as the EU Council presidency?
Of course, the pandemic makes problems we already had years and years ago much more visible, and we see the inequalities much more transparent. And we have our task to really fight against violence against women on the one hand, but also to reinforce our efforts to really push forward the gender equality in terms of equal payment, in terms of gender balance in the professions, the balance of work and life, and the separation between the work which is for family care and which is for the work people are doing. And we have to really try to support women who want to have children on the one hand, but on the other hand they want to work. And we are very convinced that we only can reach an improvement if we say, okay, the balance between work and life has to be for both, for mothers and for fathers, and we try to support a concept of partnership for the work-life balance. So we try to really think about what can we do to bring families in a situation where both moms and dads take care for the kids, and both can afford and can organize to go to work. And this is very important to come over the gender pay gap, the gender care gap, and also the gap which we see when the people go to retirement. And for that reason, we try to really support women in leading positions in their day-to-day life, and also to try to support the improvement of the social professions so that they get a better payment and that they become also attractive for men who are doing these social care professions.
Thank you. Well, we received some questions in the meantime, and I would like to encourage you as well to put more questions if you would like to. Anna is writing from UN Women. It's a question which goes to Mrs. Dalli. Does the EU Commission plan to implement a gender equality impact evaluation of the national recovery and resilience plans? Mrs. Dalli.
Well, we have already put in the gender perspective when it comes to the recovery, and it is at all levels of the Commission that we are putting in this perspective. As you know, we at the outset, from the very beginning of the work of this Commission, we set up an equality task force where there are people on this task force who are in every portfolio of the Commission, whereby they contribute to mainstream the equality perspective, which of course includes the gender equality perspective, into whatever it is that that particular portfolio is working on, whether it is the environment, whether it's the economy, whether it's health. So from the outset, if you're working on a policy or if you're working on legislation, there are these people who are there to make sure that the equality perspective is mainstream. And of course, when the pandemic broke out, in everything that the Commission was doing, we were mainstreaming and putting in this perspective also in the recovery, and we will continue, yes, to evaluate and to see how the pandemic is affecting women. And we have seen, as Franziska said, that women in domestic violence situations, their situation was compounded because they were restricted in a small area with their perpetrator in many cases. We've seen women who were frontliners working in supermarkets, working in care work. So these were the essential services which we all needed and made use of. And we were looking at also the precarious conditions of work, which sometimes these women were working in. As we know, women are at the lower levels. There's more women at the lower levels of employment. So that is something else which we are looking at. But so many lessons to be learned from this pandemic in terms of how our societies are organized, in terms of how women's rights are being respected and upheld. So really, it's been an evaluation throughout, but on the concrete and side, we were putting this input, we were feeding all this into all that the Commission was doing to offer solutions to the current situation, such as the recovery plan, which was presented.
Thank you. Mrs. Scheele, it's interesting. EIGE has taken a closer look on the consequences of the pandemic when it comes to gender equality. What are the most important findings from this research?
Yes, that's right. As soon as the pandemic started and we saw, let's say, news about spikes of domestic violence in the media, we decided immediately to take a closer look to certain elements. And I would like to focus maybe on three topics: intimate partner violence, the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the importance of the care sector. Maybe to start with intimate partner violence. With all best intentions, I think governments decided to close down the countries or to close services, to close shops, etc., etc. And in many cases, citizens were locked up in their houses. And what we saw, what I mentioned already, is the spikes of domestic violence in many countries. Yesterday, we released the results of a study examining the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on victims of intimate partner violence. And this study showed us that in many cases, member states did take measures. So they developed national action plans, they adapted legislation, they started awareness raising campaigns during the pandemic. They provided extra shelters, for example, in hotels or private Airbnbs. But the conclusion of that study is also that the support systems are very shaky, and that none of the EU member states had a disaster plan in place to deal with this, with intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So I think that's an important conclusion of that study. The second issue I would like to touch upon is the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's interesting to see how the COVID-19 pandemic is not only considered as a health issue, but also an economic issue. And I wish that gender equality would be looked at in the same way. The pandemic does not only cause, let's say, more gender inequality or reveals the existing gender inequalities in society, but it's also an economic issue. So we are currently working on an in-depth assessment of the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we will also support the future Portuguese presidency in this respect. But one thing we already see now is that we risk losing an enormous amount of women in the labor market. And this is for a big part because women take up all the care duties that come along now with the pandemic. The care duties at home, the schooling duties for their children, etc., etc. So I think we risk losing many women for the labor market. And the third segment that I would like to touch upon is the care sector. The Commissioner already mentioned this as well. The majority of people working in the care sector are women, and we clapped for them during the first wave. We came out of our houses in the evening, all over the EU, we clapped and we praised them for the difficult job they have. But still, these jobs are often undervalued and underpaid. And so what the data show is that countries must invest in care systems to properly reflect the value of this work. So these are some of the findings that we have in EIGE, and that I would like to share with you today.
Thank you. We received more questions. There is one I would like to pass to the Federal Minister. Dr. Carlien Antes is writing from the German Istanbul Convention Alliance, Violence Against Women, Institutional Matters. She is asking, the Istanbul Convention, with its intersectional approach, calls for far-reaching action at all levels of government and across the sectors to end violence against women. So how do you aim to live up to this challenge and to break down sectorial silos? How do you make this issue a priority, cross-cutting all relevant sectors?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I totally agree that this is a question of really from crucial importance. We have founded in Germany a big initiative which is called Together We Are Stronger Than Violence, and we started that initiative last year, and we have more than 100 partners meanwhile, and we have partners not only from the professional organizations in the combat against violence, but also from the supermarkets, from the public transport, from the police, from private companies who support us. And we made a big initiatives during the lockdown, where we printed on the on products in the supermarket the helpline and our internet platform Stronger Than Violence, where the women and people who are affected by violence get concrete help. This is very, very concrete to work together with partners, but nevertheless, we also have to support the women's shelters and all the organizations who give advice and support to women. For that reason, we launched a federal funding program to support all these organizations and all the 350 women shelters we have in Germany. And we want to push forward the Istanbul Convention. Even during our council, the German chair of the Committee of Ministers in the Council of Europe, we will focus that issue, and we want to not only to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Istanbul Convention, but really to advocate for an EU ratification of the Istanbul Convention and also for the ratification of member states who still have not ratified the convention. I don't mention who is the one, but I think you all know the states which are still not ratifying this Istanbul Convention. And I think it's really, really important. It's not just a question about talking about gender, the gender issue, but to talk about really a big, big problem in all our European societies. But we have a lot of violence against women in Germany. We have every third day one woman is killed by her partner or ex-partner, and we have more than 100,000 cases which are in the statistics per year from violence against women, domestic violence, and the dark number, the number of women affected, which is not in the official police statistic, it's much, much higher, because only 20% go for help, and we have to push forward all the help offers and also the help hotlines, that women really know where they can find help, and that's why it's so important that we have this all over Europe help line, so that we really give a hand for these women, so that they can know how they can get help, and this is important, really.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mrs. Monteiro. We've heard from you about Portugal's plan for the presidency of the EU Council. Mrs. Monteiro, I'm wondering, what measures are you taking on the national level in Portugal to counter the effects on the pandemic for women?
So, thank you for the question. As mentioned, our presidency will address the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 on gender equality. And in this regard, I want to thank EIGE for the research note that will support the presidency and which will focus on labor market consequences. We will also address impacts and policies at the conference on the Istanbul Convention. And in Portugal, we have been very concerned about knowing more and acting swiftly. We are currently supporting 16 new studies on the impact of COVID on the labor market, on gender stereotypes, and on violence against women. The first results will come out next January during the presidency. We publicize the regular sex disaggregated data in different sectors regarding crisis-related measures such as employment, social protection, health. And to protect domestic violence victims, we reinforced our helplines and created a new SMS service, opened to more shelters also. And
Oh, it seems we lost Mrs. Monteiro for the moment. I'm sure we will fix this in a couple of minutes and get back to her. Thank you for the meantime. I would like to pass another question to Mrs. Scheele, which comes from Marine Aldry on behalf of the European Disability Forum. Mrs. Scheele, the question is, women and girls with disabilities have been particularly affected by the pandemic as a particularly disadvantaged group. So the question is, how will women and girls with disabilities be included in the research on violence against women and other work of EIGE?
Yeah, that's a very good question, especially that now that the Commission is more and more also looking at intersectionality, and we realized that a few years ago So what we do now, for example, in the Gender Equality Index, we try to gather more and more data on intersectionality, if I may phrase it that way. Of course, those data should be available, but where we can find them, we will collect them and also spread that information and share that information with our stakeholders. But again, I have to stress, if the information is there, of course, we will find it. But if it's not available, it's more difficult. But we will still try to find the information, even if data are not easy to find. There's other ways of collecting data and information if the formal statistics are not available yet. But that's the goal. So we will also look more and more at intersectionality in our data in information gathering. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have a lot of incoming questions. So another one goes to the Federal Minister Giffey. The question comes again by Maureen Uldry. Initiatives presented are welcome, she says. We would just like to know whether the helpline you presented is accessible to deaf women as well. We need more good practices on this in the EU.
Of course, we have in this hotline also a chat function. So, and what we experience, not only deaf women use it, but also it is easier sometimes to write an email or to chat at first before you take and make a phone call. So we have good experience with a chat function, and that is that of course has to be also provided to make it possible, and also for the internet offers, it's very important that it is barrier free, so that people with handicaps can also use it. And we see that especially women with handicaps very often are much more in danger to be affected from violence. So that is a very important question. I think it has to be also kept in mind that we have to rely on that.
Another question I would like to pass over to Mrs. Dalli. It's a question from Susanne Hirschberg, Vice President EWLA. She said, we have heard a lot about now about programs in the social sector, which are without doubt very important. However, which efforts are being taken to include women in decision-making positions, like companies, boards, etc., and help weaken the famous glass ceiling? Mrs. Dalli.
Well, I'm very happy to say that for the first time we have a woman president of the European Commission, and I think that it's a very important milestone, and that the Commission is made up also of 50% women commissioners. So we are leading by example. But on the ground, there's a lot which needs to be done. And as we know, there's the Women on Boards Directive, which has been there for many years now. And we are working in order that this directive comes into fruition. So that is one area where we are working, but even through our strategy, we have a section also on women in leadership. We also address stereotypes in our strategy, which to me is very important, because there are many ideas and many prejudiced ideas. I would say there are still these prejudiced ideas of where women can, what women can achieve, and where they be influential and reach the positions which they are capable of reaching because of their competence. We have more women and young women graduating from our European universities, more women than men, but then there are much less women who are in decision-making positions. So something is going wrong there. And that is why I feel very strongly about the women on boards directive, and also on what we say in our strategy, that we must work for targets, so that we have like we did in the commission, the president, when she was setting up the commission, she asked member states to send her both men and women to choose from as commissioners. So she set targets, and I think that we must emulate that in other areas of our societies and in other institutions. Because if the will is there, then things happen. But there must be the will, the political will in this case, to and because apart from the moral argument of fairness and of justice, there is also the economic argument of making use of more talents available. And there's a lot of women's talent which is untapped because of stereotypes, because of prejudices. So really, it's a win-win situation. We will have fairer societies, and also we will thrive more economically because we will be making more use of our resources, of our human resources.
Thank you. Mrs. Montero, we're glad that you're back aboard here. Maybe you can also add on this, and there's another question for you as well, by Mariana from Portugal, Women on Boards. She's asking, what are the German and the Portuguese presidencies planning to unblock the Women on Boards directive in the EU Council? Maybe you can comment on this. Oh, it seems we lost her again. So this is really. I hope we
Shall I
come
say
back.
something?
Yes,
to that
maybe you
issue?
can answer to this question. Sure.
So the EU
Isn't me?
directive
Oh, I'm
on
sorry.
women on boards is an issue. Oh, she's there again.
Oh,
Right.
sorry, I'm back.
You are back.
Minister.
Maybe I finish.
Yes,
I say a
Mrs.
little bit, and then we hand over to Portugal,
Of
if
course.
it's okay. So the Women on Board directive is something I personally would really appreciate to push forward. We have at the moment in the German government not a clear position on that, so we try to deal with this directive like an honest broker, as in our position as the presidency is doing this. We at the moment we work very hard on a national law which is for more women in leadership and for the balanced share and of leadership positions between women and men. And we try to bring that forward, and maybe it can also be an impulse for the European level, because we are convinced that on a willingly basis nothing will happen, or it will last too long. And that's why we are very convinced that we have to give a legal framework to make public companies, but also private companies, the private economy, to bring them to a position that they are saying, okay, we have to do it. And without a legal framework, I'm really sure it will not happen very much. And that's why we fight for it. And I hope we get it on the national level. And I hope Portugal will push it forward on the European level.
Mrs. Montero, what is your perspective on this?
Well, we strongly support this directive on our part. We also have, we think, good practices, because we have 3 laws on these issues. One for quoted companies. We have already great results from this legal framework in Portugal, also in the political domain. And also for universities and the public administration. So we will push forward this directive for sure.
Thank you very much. There are much more questions. I'm afraid time is almost running out, but I will push forward one more question. There's a question by Judith Bergemann, EESC. What would be the key action areas to make sure telework is for parents increasingly is not jeopardizing gender equality. So the question of telework, who would like to comment on this? Mrs. Scheele, is this an issue which is on your agenda as well?
Well, actually, it's a very interesting question because telework is usually considered as an instrument that enables the combination of work and private life. And I think that's how it should be perceived. But as I said in my previous interventions, if it means what we see now is that it's mainly women who are juggling to keep everything organized during the pandemic. So they try to telework, they try to help children, they care for others. And I don't think that is meant with telework. So I think there's two sides of the same coin, and we have to be very careful that if people use telework as a means to provide work and private life, they should be able to do this in the best possible way. And I think that we see examples also from EIGE's research where we see that it turns out differently. So I hope that policymakers will also use that information to reflect on those provisions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in regard to the time, I would like to put one last question to each of you. And I would like to ask you to answer very, very briefly, just one or two sentences. Mrs. Montero, what gives you hope that we will make gender equality a reality in Europe pretty soon? What is convincing for you?
Thank you for the question. I think that we have now a very positive political environment, given the strength that the commissioner gives to this area. And I believe that, or we believe that we have to do structural changes in order to achieve gender equality. So this is what we have to do, and we'll push forward all these agendas during our Portuguese presidency.
Thank you. Mrs. Dalli, very briefly, what is encouraging you to hope that we will reach gender equality pretty soon?
Well, I'm very inspired by the new generation and all its diversity. Women make up half of the world's population, while half the world's population is also under the age of 25. And we have witnessed these people stepping up and taking to the streets, like Fridays for Climate marches, which were led by young women activists, the black marches of Black Lives Matters, the Polish women taking to the streets of Warsaw. So all these actions fire me up to work even more and harder. And when I see people like Franziska with the German presidency and the incoming Portuguese presidency, where we are working together, we are on the same page on actions which need to be taken, and also with what Carlien is providing us with all the data. So together I feel emboldened and I feel strong in what we can achieve.
Thank you. Mrs. Scheele, what positive signals do you see?
Well, I'm a very positive person by nature, so I think that helps. But I do agree with the previous speakers that that's what we see now. I mean, it's high on the political agenda. The pandemic, even though it's a terrible thing, it also reveals a lot of important information. Indeed, we see citizens go out in the streets. We see young people being very much engaged. So, and we do see progress, although it's really slow. But we do see some progress, and I hope this will continue. So, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say to you at the moment. Thank you.
Mrs. Giffey, what gives you hope?
Very short. Behind me is our motto of our policy in the Ministry for Women Affairs. Women can do everything. And this is not just only a fact, it's also something we want to have. And if it is the case that it's not the case that women do everything or can do everything, we have to take care to make the framework and the general circumstances that they can do everything. And so let's just orientate on that, and let's push away all the obstacles, so that we can really reach it.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you to all of you. It was a very inspiring debate, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow, the informal meeting of the EU gender equality ministers, which will facilitate an exchange of good practices on this issue. So, looking forward, thank you very much to this first panel discussion. We will have a very short break, and we will continue at 4 o'clock p.m. German time with the issue of lessons learned from the pandemic. We dive a bit deeper into the issue. See you again in a minute.